You're holding 13 pounds of pure 23-karat gold in your hand.
Right, which is just, it's incredibly heavy.
Yeah, the sheer weight of it is just pulling your arms down.
Yeah.
And it's shaped like the severed head of a stag.
Covered in all these heavily engraved mythological figures, yeah.
Exactly. And this object was buried in the cold, dark dirt of the Balkans for 2 millennia. Just untouched, entirely silent.
Right.
So this deep dive was put together specifically for you right now to answer one massive sweeping question: who buried it?
And, well, why did they leave absolutely no written explanation for what it means?
Yeah. That is the crazy part to me. Because they didn't leave a written record, they're basically the ultimate voiceless civilization. We're talking about the ancient Thracians.
Which is, I mean, that archival silence is the central paradox we really have to navigate here.
Right.
We're looking at a society that possessed, staggering material wealth. They marshaled these terrifying military coalitions, and they developed a theology complex enough to supposedly birth the legend of Orpheus. But they did all of this without a formalized alphabet. There are no scrolls. There are no stone stele inscribed with laws.
So no diplomatic archives or anything?
Nothing. It is a total historical void.
Which makes our mission today pretty intense. We're sifting through an enormous stack of sources, archaeological journals, metallurgical analyses, military histories, and our goal is to bypass the heavy biases of everyone who wrote about them.
Because the people writing about them had major agendas.
Right. The Greeks and Romans overwhelmingly viewed the Thracians as just like bloodthirsty, unsophisticated barbarians.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, we have to cut through modern political agendas, specifically 20th century propaganda that really warped their history for state-building purposes.
So we're going to try to find the real Thracians through the spectacular dirt and the really enigmatic gold they left behind.
It's basically a forensic challenge.
Yeah.
Because the tension lies between this entirely non-literate society and a material culture that is breathtakingly sophisticated.
Yeah.
We can't just, translate a text to understand them.
Right. We're forced to read their burial mounds and their weapon designs.
Exactly. We have to read solid gold drinking horns as if they were complex literature.
It was actually reading through the source materials, and it struck me that piecing together Thracian history it's like trying to write a definitive psychological biography of a reclusive genius by only reading the unhinged Yelp reviews left by his bitterest business rivals.
That captures the methodology perfectly.
And then trying to reverse engineer his personality just by staring at the contents of his jewelry box.
Right. Because the Greeks, sitting in their nice coastal city-states, they're the ones who wrote the Yelp reviews.
Right.
They were terrified of the Thracians, but they also desperately needed them for trade and warfare.
So to understand why those reviews were so hostile, we really have to look at the geographical reality the Thracians inhabited.
Yeah, because it fundamentally dictated their worldview and their economy.
Let's lay out that map for everyone, because when I picture ancient empires, I usually think of hard borders, like a wall, a river, a line in the sand.
Sure. But the sources describe Thrace as this incredibly vast, totally porous territory. It is massive. If you look at a map of Southeast Europe today, the Thracian footprint covers modern-day Bulgaria, Romania, North Macedonia, northern Greece, the European portion of Turkey, and it even spills all the way over into northwestern Anatolia in Asia Minor.
Wow, so a huge chunk of real estate.
Right, and it's an incredibly diverse topography. You've got the really fertile plains along the Danube River, the dense, almost impenetrable forests of the Balkan Mountains, and then the rugged alpine terrain of the Rhodope Mountains.
So with a footprint that massive and that diverse, there's just no way they were a centralized, monolithic empire where everyone answered to one guy in a capital city, right?
No, absolutely not. They were highly fractured. Like the Thracian identity is just an umbrella term for dozens of fiercely independent, often warring tribes.
Oh, interesting. So who are the big players?
Well, in the south and central regions, you had the Odrysians. They eventually consolidated enough power to form a massive kingdom.
The Odrysians.
Yeah. Then up in the northeast, closer to the Danube, you had the Getae, who had a very distinctly different religious outlook.
Right. The sources mention them having some pretty wild beliefs.
They did. And then in the high, treacherous mountains lived the Bessi. They were this rugged tribe that guarded the most sacred oracular shrines.
Okay.
And down near the Aegean coast were the Sycones, who factor really heavily into the earliest Greek myths.
So we have this massive clash of economic systems happening between these inland Thracian tribes and the coastal Greeks. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this because it really seems to be the root of why the Greeks called them barbarians in the first place.
It absolutely is.
The Greeks operated on a system the sources call katapoleis.
Right, meaning by cities.
Hmm.
The Greek economic engine was completely market-driven.
Okay.
They established emporia, which were these dedicated coastal trade hubs. A Greek merchant would buy goods from the interior, bring them down to the emporia, load them onto a ship, and export them across the Mediterranean for a profit.
So wealth was generated through, commerce, maritime trade, and physically exchanging coins in a marketplace.
Exactly. That was their definition of a civilized economy.
But the Thracians operated on completely different software. The Odrysian kingdom used a system scholars call kata ethni, which translates to by tribes.
Right.
The notes refer to this as a tributary economy. How does that actually work in the day-to-day life of an average Odrysian farmer?
Well, in a tributary system, there is no free market capitalism at all. The Thracian king was considered the supreme, divine owner of literally all the land.
He owned everything.
Everything. So the rural agrarian communities works the soil and a massive portion of their agricultural yield. So wheat, barley, sheep, timber flowed directly up to the aristocracy as tribute.
Wow. So no local markets.
Right. The king and his paradynastoi, meaning his regional co-rulers or vassals, essentially functioned as this highly centralized wealth extraction mechanism.
So the farmer isn't taking his extra wheat to a market to sell for silver coins. He is literally just handing it over to an armed vassal of the king.
Exactly that. The Odrysian kings didn't need a developed internal market system because they simply commanded the resources by force and right.
That's wild.
And because moving thousands of tons of grain over these rough mountain roads was a logistical nightmare, the Thracian court was highly mobile.
Oh, so they didn't just sit in one palace.
No, the king and his massive retinue would constantly travel from region to region, literally consuming the tribute on site.
That makes sense.
But you have to imagine, to a Greek merchant sitting in Athens, measuring out silver drachmas for a jar of olive oil, this Thracian system looked incredibly primitive. It looked totally barbaric.
But the Greeks were huge hypocrites about this, right? I mean, they mocked the Thracians for not living in walled cities and for drinking unmixed wine. But the second a Greek city-state got into a war, who was the first person they called?
The Thracian mercenaries?
Always.
Yeah. Athenians, Spartans, Persians, Macedonians, and eventually the Romans, they were all obsessed with hiring Thracian fighters. Because the geopolitical reality was that the Thracian environment produced the most lethal, adaptable warriors in the ancient Mediterranean.
So the barbarian label was kind of just political propaganda masking this deep military inferiority complex.
Very much so. Think about it. A heavily armored Greek hoplite in a rigid phalanx formation is incredibly effective on a flat, even plain.
Sure, like a bulldozer.
Right.
Right.
But if you march that phalanx into the dense forests and steep ravines of the Balkan Mountains, it completely falls apart. You can't hold a phalanx in a forest.
And the sources really emphasized their mastery of guerrilla warfare. Like, they didn't line up in polite rows to fight. They used the terrain as a weapon.
The Thracians basically perfected hit-and-run tactics. They fielded highly mobile light cavalry and these agile infantry units called piltasts, named after the crescent-shaped wicker shields they carried.
Right.
They would wait until an invading army was stretched out in a narrow valley, launch this devastating surprise attack with javelins, and then just completely vanish back into the tree line before the enemy commander could even issue an order to counterattack.
It sounds terrifying. And the weapons they use for this kind of brutal, chaotic combat are fascinating. I want to really dig into the biomechanics of their armory here. Let's start with the rhomphaea.
The rhomphaea is arguably the most terrifying weapon of antiquity. It really is.
The descriptions in the sources sound insane.
It's a pole arm, but a highly specialized one. It features a very long, straight wooden handle, topped with a massive, single-edged iron blade.
Okay, so like a spear.
Not quite. The genius of the design is that the blade curves slightly inward, like a sickle.
Oh, wow. So you weren't just poking people with it.
No, it was a hacking and slicing weapon that required two hands to wield. Because of the sharpened edges on the inside of the curve, a warrior swinging a rhomphaea doesn't just deliver a percussive blow. The blade naturally pulls toward the wielder, creating this massive, deep draw cut.
So it's basically a giant two-handed scythe built for human armor.
Exactly. A skilled Thracian swinging this could easily hook the edge of a Roman legionary shield rip it out of his hands, and cleave right through his helmet in a single fluid motion.
That is brutal.
The leverage it provided was unmatched in close-quarters mountain combat.
And then there's a secondary weapon mentioned in the texts, the Machaira.
Right, where the Ramphia gave them reach, the Machaia was for the absolute chaos of a tight melee.
Like when things get really close.
Yeah. It was a crooked, short sword with a forward curving blade. It functioned a lot like a modern machete or a Gurkha kukri.
Okay, so it's top-heavy.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It concentrates the mass of the blade near the tip, so it delivers devastating chopping power rather than the thrusting action you'd see with a Roman gladius.
So when you look at the whole picture here, this tributary economy funding these massive mobile armies equipped with highly specialized terrain-specific weaponry, you realize their wildness wasn't a lack of civilization at all.
No, not at all.
It was a hyper-evolved adaptation to one of the roughest neighborhoods on Earth.
It really forces us to redefine what civilized actually means. I mean, they didn't build their empire with market stalls. They built it with iron and highly organized tribal loyalty.
But they did build cities. I mean, they didn't just wander the woods forever. And the scale of the sites the archaeologists are uncovering completely shatters the illusion of these simple forest dwellers. Let's talk about Merpericon, because the timeline of this place just breaks my brain.
Proto-Pericon is incredible. It's located high up in the eastern Rhodope Mountains, and it is the largest megalithic complex in the entire Balkan Peninsula.
Wow.
And you're right to focus on the timeline. Excavations reveal that this single location was used for continuous spiritual and political activity for over 5,000 years.
5,000 years.
Yes, dating all the way back to the 6th millennium BCE.
5,000 years of uninterrupted use. Just the sheer logistics of maintaining a mountain sanctuary for that long is staggering to think about.
And it isn't just a few stones stacked on a hill either. The Thracians carved an entire city directly out of the living bedrock.
Out of the mountain itself.
Exactly. They engineered enormous rock-hewn channels to manage water, massive cisterns, broad staircases, and these huge, flat ceremonial platforms. It implies an incredibly stable, deeply rooted religious tradition that predates almost every major civilization we usually talk about.
And the sources mention that Propericon housed a massive temple dedicated to a god the Greeks identified as Dionysus.
Right.
And there is a specific historical anecdote here that shows just how much diplomatic weight this site actually carried. So in 334 BC, Alexander the Great is preparing to launch his massive invasion of the Persian Empire.
Right. Arguably the most powerful Greek Macedonian ruler alive.
Exactly. And before he crosses into Asia, he travels into the Thracian mountains specifically to visit this temple at Propericon.
The historical accounts tell us he participated in an oracular fire ritual there. The priest would pour wine onto this massive stone altar, and the height of the flames that erupted would dictate the prophecy.
So they were basically reading the fire.
Yes, and the fire reportedly flared incredibly high, and the Thracian priests prophesied that Alexander would conquer the entire known world.
The fact that Alexander the Great felt he needed spiritual validation from a so-called barbarian oracle before attacking Persia, that speaks volumes.
It really does.
It shows a profound underlying respect for Thracian mysticism, regardless of what the Greek politicians were saying back in Athens.
The Greeks definitely understood that Thracian spiritual centers held immense power. But we should note, the Thracians also built more traditional, Hellenistic-style royal capitals when they needed to engage in high-level diplomacy. A perfect example of this is Suthopolis.
Right, Suthopolis. That was the capital city of the Odrysian king Seuthes III. The archaeology there revealed incredible urban planning, and the texts highlight the famous Suthopolis inscription.
A very important document.
Yeah, it details King Seuthes and his wife, Berenike, who was actually a Macedonian princess. So it's clear evidence of complex political integration, strategic marriage alliances, a highly cosmopolitan royal court. But what happened to Suthopolis in the modern era is one of the most unbelievable stories in all of archaeology.
Oh, the modern fate of the city is deeply, deeply tragic. In antiquity, the city was sacked and destroyed, likely by invading Celts in the 270s BC, or maybe slightly later, by Antiochus II.
Right, standard ancient warfare stuff.
Yeah, it was buried and forgotten for 2 millennia. Fast forward to the 20th century, and archaeologists finally discover it. They spend years meticulously excavating the streets, the palaces, the fortifications.
They basically pull this ancient capital out of the dirt, finally giving this voiceless civilization a physical shape for the modern world. And then what does the government do?
Well, in 1955, the Bulgarian communist regime deliberately flooded the entire valley.
It's insane.
They submerged the newly excavated ancient capital of Suthopolis beneath the waters of an artificial lake, the Koprinka Reservoir, just to complete a hydroelectric dam project.
I genuinely cannot wrap my head around that. You discover the absolute crown jewel of your nation's ancient heritage, map it out, and then actively decide to drown it under millions of gallons of water. Why?
To understand why they did it, we have to look really closely at the science of trachology itself and how it was profoundly instrumentalized by the Bulgarian state, particularly in those decades following World War II.
Okay.
The communist authorities were engaged in a massive ideological project. They needed to foster a deep sense of national pride and cultural richness to legitimize the modern state. But they had to do it within the strict ideological confines of Marxist historical materialism.
Right, because according to strict Marxist theory, history is just a series of class struggles, moving from primitive communism to slave societies to feudalism to capitalism and finally to modern socialism.
Exactly.
So how on earth do they fit these insanely wealthy, gold-hoarding Thracian kings into a socialist narrative?
It took some creative filtering. The state-sponsored archaeologists, led by figures like Alexander Foll, who later actually founded the Institute of Thraceology, they heavily filtered the narrative.
How so?
They framed the ancient Thracians as an indigenous, almost utopian, agrarian working-class society. The Thracians were depicted as these noble peasants resisting the imperialist, slave-holding economies of the Greeks and Romans.
Wow.
And the magnificent gold and silver artifacts pulled from the tombs were championed as proof of the cultural richness of the indigenous working masses.
So they basically weaponized the dirt. They needed the artifacts for museum displays to prove how great the Bulgarian homeland had always been. But the actual physical city of Suthopolis, a city built by an elite, wealth-extracting king, was structurally inconvenient.
Highly inconvenient.
And stood in the way of a modern Soviet-style industrial dam project.
Exactly. The ideology required the symbols of Thracian greatness, but industrial progress took precedence over preserving the messy, complex reality of the actual ruins.
That is just wild.
It is a stark reminder that the history of the Thracians is constantly being overwritten by whoever's holding the shovel.
Man. Well, let's talk about the specific symbols they were digging up, because when the Thracian elites weren't conquering territory, they were accumulating luxury goods on a scale that is just difficult to comprehend.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources spend a lot of time detailing this gift exchange economy and their profound love for foreign luxury, specifically something called the Greco-Persian style.
We have to remember that in the ancient world, before the widespread standardization of fiat currency, high-level diplomacy ran entirely on precious metals.
Right, no wire transfers.
Exactly. When foreign envoys from Persia, from Macedon, from Athens, wanted to secure a military alliance with an Odrysian king or negotiate safe passage for trade routes, they didn't just sign a piece of parchment. They brought luxury items.
Like heavy gold.
Gold and silver vessels had universally accepted monetary weight and immense status value.
And the sources mention a very specific flow of Persian or Achaemenid luxury goods into Thrace. We are talking about vessels like philae, which are these wide, shallow drinking bowls used for libations,
Right.
and the kantharos, which is a deep drinking cup with high handles. And the texts note that the shapes of the cups found in Thracian dirt are perfectly identical to the ones carved into the Apadana.
The Apadana being the grand architectural reliefs in the Persian capital of Persepolis.
Right. So the Thracian kings were getting the good stuff straight from the source.
They were. But the crucial detail here is that the Thracians were not passive recipients. They weren't just hoarding Persian cups in a dark room somewhere.
Right. They were hacking them.
They were actively altering them to serve their own political purposes. The archaeology reveals several Persian philae where an Odrysian king, specifically King Cotys, deliberately soldered his own name and local religious imagery, like the head of Apollo, directly onto the omphalos.
The omphalos being the raised central boss in the middle of the bowl.
Yes, exactly.
This reminds me of high-end corporate networking. If a venture capital firm wants to lock in a massive partnership with a tech CEO, they don't just hand him a generic gold Rolex.
Right.
They engrave the CEO's name or their own company logo right onto the face of the watch. It elevates the gift into a binding contract and a territorial marker.
That is a phenomenal analogy. By stamping his name onto an imperial Persian vessel, King Cotys is appropriating the immense prestige of the Achaemenid Empire and making it entirely Odrysian.
That's a huge power move.
Huge. Whenever that cup was brought out at a royal banquet, every tribal leader in the room saw that Cody's had the wealth and the diplomatic leverage to command tribute from the greatest empire in the East.
But the Thracians didn't stop at just modifying foreign gifts, right?
Yeah.
Because they sat geographically at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, their own local workshops began synthesizing these different artistic traditions.
They did. They essentially birthed a completely new aesthetic, the Greco-Persian style, blending Eastern motifs with Mediterranean craftsmanship.
And the quality of what those local workshops produced is staggering. Which brings us to the actual artifacts. We really need to introduce a highly specific technical term here.
Tereutics.
Yes, tereutics.
I saw that word everywhere in the literature.
Ew.
Tereutics. It sounds like a medical condition, but the sources treat it like the absolute highest form of ancient high-tech manufacturing.
Tereutics is the intricate art of working precious metals. So hammering, chasing, and embossing gold and silver to create complex three-dimensional reliefs.
Okay.
It requires an incredibly sophisticated understanding of metallurgy. You don't just pour liquid gold into a mold.
Right.
You take a flat sheet of metal, rest it on a yielding surface like warm pine pitch, and hammer it from the inside out to create volume. That's a technique called repoussé.
Oh, wow.
Then you flip it over and use tiny specialized punches to carve the microscopic details on the front. So when we look at Thracian tereutics, we aren't just looking at pretty jewelry meant to show off an aristocrat's bank account. Because they had no written alphabet, this highly technical metalwork essentially became their political and religious language.
Precisely.
They were literally writing their theology in gold.
And the vocabulary of that language is blinding. To understand the scale, we have to look at the megafines. The most famous is the panegyriste treasure.
The discovery of this is wild. It was 1949, and three brothers were just out digging for clay near the town of Panegyriste.
Right, just a normal day.
Yeah, they hit something hard in the dirt, and what they pull out of the mud is a set of 9 incredibly ornate vessels, and the metallurgical analysis is jaw-dropping. We are talking about 6.164 kilograms of almost pure 23-karat gold.
Over 13 pounds of pure gold. The sheer material value is immense, but the craftsmanship is what truly matters here.
What exactly was in the set?
The set includes a massive amphora, which is a ceremonial pouring vessel with 2 handles and several drinking horns that terminate in highly detailed animal heads. So stags, rams, and even the faces of women.
Wow.
And the bodies of the vessels are densely packed with scenes of Greek mythology depicting heroes like Heracles.
But the sources stress that even though the characters are Greek, the aesthetic execution, the way the figures are stylized, is uniquely Thracian, right?
Very much so.
They adopted the foreign imagery but spoke it with a local accent.
Exactly.
And then, for sheer volume, we have the Rogozin treasure, discovered in 1986.
The Rogozin treasure is entirely different in nature. It isn't a single banquet set buried all at once like Panegyriste. It consists of 165 silver and silver-gilt vessels.
That is a massive hoard.
It is. And the stylistic variations showed that this collection was slowly accumulated by the Odrysian royal house over a period of about 150 years.
I was reading the breakdown of what was actually in the Rogozin find, and the numbers absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
The math is incredible.
It really is. The set contains exactly 54 jugs and 108 fialae. That is a perfect 1-to-2 ratio. This cannot be a coincidence. What is the mechanism behind this specific math?
It is absolutely intentional, and it reveals the invisible architecture of their belief system. The numbers 54 and 108 are deeply significant in ancient pan-Indo-European numerology and early Orphic thought.
Okay, let's break the math down.
All right, the base unit is the number 27. Why? Because 27 is 3 cubed. 3 times 3 times 3.
Right.
The number 3 represents the tripartite nature of the cosmos, the underworld, the earth, and the heavens. So 27 is a highly sacred number reflecting cosmic totality, and it also roughly tracks the visible days of the lunar cycle.
Okay, so 54 is 2 times 27, and 108 is 4 times 27.
Precisely. The ratio physically manifests a celestial mathematical harmony. When a Thracian king laid out these 165 vessels for a sacred banquet, he wasn't just setting a very expensive table.
Right.
He was arranging a physical model of the cosmos. The arrangement of the silver was a ritual act designed to align the earthly royal court with the divine order of the universe.
It's celestial clockwork made of silver.
It really is.
And just in case anyone argues that the Thracians only learned this high-level metalwork because the Greeks or Persians taught them, the sources point to the Valchitran treasure.
Oh, the Valchitran treasure is the definitive proof of indigenous mastery. It is a massive hoard of gold vessels, including this incredibly strange three-part linked vessel.
And how old is it?
It dates all the way back to the Bronze Age, somewhere between the 16th and 12th centuries BCE.
So thousands of years before the Odrysian kingdom, way before the classical Greek era.
Right. It proves that the institution of the wealthy, ritually focused Thracian king-priest and their obsession with Tauriutics grew organically out of the Balkan soil. It was not imported.
This brings up a major logistical question for me. We have these millions of dollars worth of astronomically complex gold and silver items. They use them to map the cosmos during sacred banquets. But then the archaeology shows that they routinely buried them. They took these masterpieces completely out of circulation. Why would a wealth-extracting king deliberately bury his own treasury in the dirt?
Because it was the ultimate transaction. Scholars suggest that sets like the Rogozin treasure were buried as direct gifts to the divine, specifically what is referred to as the Thracian sacred triad, often conceptualized under the Greek names of the mother goddess Artemis and Apollo.
Okay.
By burying the wealth, the king proves that his power is so absolute, his connection to the gods so secure, that he can afford to permanently discard a fortune.
Wow, he isn't banking his wealth in a vault, he is banking it directly with the gods.
Exactly, ensuring his divine legitimacy in this life and the next.
Which perfectly transitions us into the dark, obsessive second half of the Thracian worldview. We've seen how they managed their economy, how they fought, and how they banqueted. But the Thracians really went all out for death.
They absolutely did.
The wealth and the engineering they poured into the living world was entirely matched and often exceeded by the architecture they built for the dead. We have to walk into the palaces of the dead.
The scale of their funerary architecture is just astonishing. In central Bulgaria, there is a region around the modern town of Kazanlak that archaeologists refer to as the Valley of the Thracian Kings.
Okay.
In this single geographic concentration alone, there are over 1,500 tumuli.
Define tumuli for us, because we aren't just talking about a simple gravestone here.
A tumulus is a massive, highly engineered burial mound. The Thracians would construct a monumental stone tomb at ground level, and then they would move thousands of tons of earth to bury the entire structure under an artificial hill.
So they're literally making mountains.
Yes, these mounds alter the very horizon of the landscape.
And the most famous of these is the Kazanlak tomb, which actually has the distinction of being the very first Bulgarian site ever added to the UNESCO World Heritage List back in 1979. I was looking at the architectural diagrams in the notes, and there's a term that keeps coming up regarding the layout: the dromos. What is the function of the dromos?
The dromos is the long, narrow corridor or antechamber that physically bridges the world of the living outside the mound with the burial chamber deep inside.
So it's like a hallway.
It serves as a transitional liminal space. In the Kazanlak tomb, the dromos features a ceiling built using overstepping bricks, an early form of tholos, or beehive vaulting.
Which demonstrates immense architectural sophistication.
Absolutely.
And what they found inside tells an incredibly vivid story. In the main, round burial chamber laid to rest under these breathtaking, vividly painted frescoes of a grand funerary feast were a man and a woman.
Right.
But the outer corridor, the dromos, was treated like a security checkpoint for the afterlife. They found a warrior buried there holding a mahaira, that crooked, armor-chopping sword we discussed earlier.
Yes.
And alongside him were the skeletal remains of a fully grown horse.
The tomb was provisioned with everything required for the soul's journey and defense.
But if we want to talk about truly surreal, almost hallucinatory tomb architecture, we have to travel northeast and look at the Svishtari tomb.
Oh, Svishtari is incredible.
Yes, it dates to the early 3rd century BCE and is believed to be the resting place of a powerful Getae king named Dromacates. I was looking at the photos of the burial chamber, and the walls are lined with these 10 figures called caryatids.
Right.
Usually when I picture a caryatid, I think of the Acropolis in Athens, those serene marble women acting as pillars to hold up a temple porch. But the notes describe these Svishtari caryatids as being half-plant. What on earth does that look like?
It is one of the most striking visual anomalies in ancient art. The 10 caryatids in Svishtari are carved in high relief around the walls of the chamber. From the waist up, they are women, their arms raised rigidly to physically support the vaulted ceiling of the tomb.
Okay.
But from the waist down, their bodies seamlessly transform into large, curling acanthus leaves. They resemble an upward blooming lotus.
It's like something out of a dark fantasy novel. What is the mechanism behind that specific botanical imagery? Like, why turn a woman into a hern?
The acanthus plant is incredibly resilient. It dies back in the winter and forcefully blooms again in the spring. In ancient Mediterranean iconography, it is the ultimate symbol of enduring life, regeneration, and immortality.
Wow, okay.
By lining the tomb with half-human, half-plant figures supporting the ceiling, the architect is visually stating that a tomb is not a place of final decay. It is a crucible of rebirth. The structural pillars of the afterlife are literally made of immortal vegetation.
That is beautiful, but the architecture is only half the story. The really shocking stuff happens when archaeologists actually clear the dirt and look for the bodies.
Right.
Because of this Feshtari leaf women and the Kazan-like frescoes, you expect them to uncover a beautifully preserved golden mummy, like Tutankhamun.
Sure.
But the reality is incredibly dark. The sources talk about widespread dismemberment.
This is perhaps the most enigmatic, and to a modern mind, horrifying aspect of Thracian archaeology. When excavators break the seal on an undisturbed Thracian tomb, they almost never find a complete, fully articulated human skeleton laid out peacefully.
Never.
Almost never. Instead, they find a shattered puzzle. There might be a skull placed carefully in a ceramic pot in one corner, a severed femur resting on a stone bench, ribs scattered across the floor.
That is so morbid.
And DNA analysis often reveals that these scattered bones belong to entirely different individuals.
Wait, I need to pause here. You are telling me that to achieve divine immortality, your followers have to hack your corpse apart and scatter your bones around the room like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yes. The archaeological evidence for this deliberate postmortem dismemberment dates all the way back to the beginning of the first millennium BC in Thrace.
Why would they do that?
To understand it, we really need an analogy. Think of the physical body as a piece of hardware, like a computer hard drive, and the soul is the highly sensitive data stored on it.
Okay, tracking with you.
In the Thracian philosophical view, the physical world is a heavy, corrupting prison. To ensure that the sensitive data, the soul, can successfully upload to the divine realm, you have to completely physically smash the hard drive so the data cannot be tethered to the earthly desk anymore.
Wow. So the destruction of the body isn't a desecration, it's an enforced liberation.
Exactly. It forces the eternal essence to ascend. And this philosophical concept wasn't limited to human bodies. It extended to their wealth, leading to a practice scholars call the ritual killing of objects.
I was wondering about that. You mentioned earlier that they buried those incredibly expensive gold and silver cups, but the notes say that very often those objects are found deliberately destroyed.
Yes. When you find an imported priceless silver cantharos or a lethal iron machaira in a tomb, it is frequently bent completely in half or shattered with a hammer before it was placed in the dirt.
Following the hard drive logic, the object has to die in our physical dimension so its spiritual essence can cross the veil and serve the king in the afterlife.
Precisely. You cannot take a living, whole sword into the realm of the dead. You have to kill the sword first.
And this brings us back to the horses. We keep seeing horse skeletons in the Duomo of these tombs. Was the horse just there so the king had something to ride in the afterlife?
It is far more cosmic than that. In Thracian belief, the horse was the supreme solar animal. The elite Thracian tribes practiced a deeply ingrained form of solar worship.
So the horse is tied to the sun.
Yes. The horse was ritually sacrificed in the dromos not just as a mount, but to serve as the engine for the solar chariot, physically pulling the deceased king's liberated soul upward into the sun, where he would be permanently deified.
Man. So we have dismembered bodies, smashed gold, and solar ascensions. All of these intense esoteric mechanics lead us directly to the absolute epicenter of Thracian mystery.
They do.
The most famous and undoubtedly the most controversial Thracian of all time, Orpheus.
Ah, Orpheus. If you want to start an academic brawl at a classical history conference, just bring up Thracian Orphism?
Let's lay out the baseline first. Most of us know the Greek myth. Orpheus is the ultimate tragic musician. He plays the lyre so beautifully that trees uproot themselves to listen.
Right.
His wife, Eurydice, dies of a snake bite, so he physically walks down into the underworld to get her back. He plays a song so heartbreaking that Hades, the god of the dead, literally cries and agrees to let Eurydice go on one strict condition.
Don't look back.
Exactly. Orpheus has to walk back to the surface, and he cannot turn around to look at her until they are both in the sunlight.
And in typical tragic fashion, just as he crosses the threshold, the anxiety breaks him. He turns around to make sure she is there, and she vanishes back into the shadows forever.
And then he spends the rest of his life wandering the wilderness in grief until he encounters a group of frenzied women, the Manads, who tear him limb from limb.
which perfectly mirrors the Thracian practice of dismemberment we just talked about.
Exactly. But the ancient sources we are analyzing, texts by Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Apollonius of Rhodes, they don't treat him as a fairy tale at all. They present Orpheus as a historical, flesh-and-blood political figure.
They do. The classical historians treat him as a foundational Thracian king-priest. They specifically link his origin to the Ciconian tribe, locating his seat of power near the coastal town of Ismarus. And they place him chronologically deep in the heroic age, a generation before the Trojan War.
And Diodorus makes a very specific claim about his education. He writes that Orpheus, as a royal heir, traveled across the Mediterranean to Memphis in Egypt to receive the highest level of esoteric priestly education available in the ancient world.
The Egyptian connection is crucial here. Memphite theology was renowned for its deep, complex focus on the afterlife, the preservation of the soul, and rigorous ritual purity.
Okay.
Diodorus claims that when Orpheus returned to the rugged mountains of Thrace, he used that Egyptian knowledge to launch a massive religious reformation.
He looked at the old Thracian system, which presumably involved a lot of bloody animal sacrifices and martial violence, and tried to completely rewrite the code. What were his specific reforms?
He attempted to abolish blood sacrifice entirely. He introduced strict dietary laws, specifically mandating vegetarianism, arguing that consuming flesh tethered the soul to the animalistic material world.
Wow, vegetarianism in ancient Thrace.
Yeah. He instituted rigorous rituals of bodily purification, and most importantly, he shifted the theological focus heavily towards solar worship.
Like with the horses.
Exactly. The core of his teaching was the doctrine of the transmigration of the soul, the belief that the soul is trapped in a cycle of reincarnation, bouncing from body to body, until it achieves pure spiritual enlightenment through ascetic practices and finally escapes into the solar divine.
And this intense focus on solar worship isn't just an abstract literary concept, it is physically engineered into the Thracian landscape. The most breathtaking proof of this is the Womb Cave.
The Womb Cave is a masterclass in ancient archaeoastronomy. It's located high in the Rhodope Mountains near the village of Nenkovo.
Describe how this actually works, because it sounds like ancient laser targeting.
It basically is. It is a natural limestone cave that the Thracian priests meticulously enlarged and carved by hand until the interior perfectly mirrored the anatomical shape of a human womb.
Okay.
At the very back of this dark, deep cavern, they carved a stone altar. But the true genius is the orientation. The cave mouth is angled with such precise mathematical and astronomical accuracy that it only works flawlessly twice a year, at noon on the exact days of the spring and autumn equinoxes.
When the celestial clock aligns perfectly.
Precisely. On those two specific days, as the sun hits its zenith, a concentrated beam of solid sunlight penetrates the narrow slit of the cave mouth.
Like a spotlight.
Yes. And as the Earth rotates, that beam of light elongates, creeping deeper and deeper into the darkness until it perfectly illuminates the altar at the very back of the womb. It is a massive physical, kinetic representation of the divine solar force fertilizing the dark chthonic Earth.
It's unbelievable. You have this towering philosophical system transmigration of souls, ascetic purity, precision archaeoastronomy. But here is where we hit the massive academic war. The sources introduce a methodological term, interpretatio thracica.
Right. This brings us back to the ideological battles of modern history. Interpretatio thracica is a framework heavily championed by the Bulgarian school of thraciology.
Okay.
They argue that Thracian Orphism was absolutely real, indigenous, and historical. They posit that it was an elite, closed, aristocratic doctrine of self-improvement reserved strictly for the Odrysian and Getae royalty and their highest priests.
The sources mention a specific group of initiates called the Tistae.
Right, the Kistae, which ancient writers translated as those who walk on clouds.
Cloudwalkers.
Yeah. They were essentially a monastic order of celibate, vegetarian, holy men living in the high mountain sanctuaries, enforcing this Orphic doctrine, entirely separate from the common agrarian workers.
But the Western scholars reading the exact same texts completely reject this. They argue that Orphism is essentially a massive Greek psyop.
They do. The skeptical Western view is that Orphism as a coherent, organized religion is largely an invention of 19th century classical studies.
Wow.
They argue that the ancient Greeks, living in highly structured, rational, hyper-regulated city-states, had a deep psychological need for an exotic other. So they projected their own fantasies of untamed nature, wild ecstasy, and primitive magic onto the geographic north, onto Thrace.
So they just made it up.
In this view, Orpheus is a Greek literary invention, strategically placed in the dark Thracian forests to give the mystery cult an aura of ancient savage authenticity.
So it's like a modern wellness brand claiming their new meditation technique is an ancient, secret Himalayan monk tradition just to sell more books, when in reality it was invented in a coffee shop in Los Angeles.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Is Orpheus just a cultural mirage?
It requires a very delicate balance of the evidence. It is undeniable that the Greeks supply their own narrative filter, the romantic tragedy of Eurydice, the perfectly rhyming poetry that is likely Greek window dressing.
Right.
However, the raw fundamental mechanics of the religion are genuinely Thracian. The Greeks did not invent the megalithic solar alignment of the womb cave. They did not invent the 5,000-year continuous use of the Papericon sanctuary.
That dirt doesn't lie.
Exactly. The deeply ingrained belief in the soul's immortality and the ecstatic mountain rituals existed in the Balkan dirt long before Athens was an empire. The Greeks merely provided a marketable narrative structure for a profound, terrifying spiritual reality they encountered in the north.
Okay, so if this highly elevated, mathematically precise vegetarian Orphism was the religion of the kings and the Tistai cloudwalkers, what was everyone else doing? If I am an average Dresian barley farmer, I'm not doing geometry with gold cups, who am I praying to? Let's open up the bizarre, ecstatic Thracian pantheon.
To map the pantheon, we have to navigate another academic hurdle: Interpretatio Graeca, or Romana.
The habit of translating foreign gods.
Yes. When a Greek or Roman historian encountered a Thracian deity, they almost never bothered to record the actual original name or the specific local nuances of the mythology.
They just rebranded them.
They engaged in supreme cultural arrogance. If they saw a Thracian tribe worshipping a sky god who threw lightning, the Greek writer just crossed out the Thracian name and wrote Zeus.
Wow.
If they saw a god of war, they wrote Ares. Because the Thracians lacked a written language to correct the historical record, their actual indigenous divine names were largely erased and overwritten by Mediterranean labels.
But thankfully, a few names survived the filter, and the deities we do have records of are incredibly vivid. Let's start with the most prominent female deity, Bendis.
Bendis is a towering primal figure in Thracian religion. She functioned as the Great Mother Goddess. When the Greeks encountered her, they recognized her as a Patnia Theron, a master concept meaning the mistress of animals.
Mistress of animals.
Yes. She was the sovereign of the wild, untamed aspects of nature, the deep forests, and the hunt. The Greeks eventually syncretized or blended her with their own goddess Artemis, specifically identifying her as Artemis Phosphoros, the bringer of light.
The visual iconography associated with Bendis is so distinct. She isn't wearing a flowing silk toga. She is depicted wearing a specialized foxskin cap with ear flaps, known as an alapecus, high leather hunting boots, a heavy Thracian cloak, and carrying 2 hunting spears. It is a deeply rugged, practical aesthetic.
She was the goddess of a harsh environment, and she commanded immense respect. She was worshipped at open-air, megalithic rock sanctuaries across the mountains, and she was the patron deity of major Thracian settlements like the city of Kabyle.
Right.
But what proves her profound influence is how she penetrated the Greek world.
Yeah, the sources note that around 429 BCE, the worship of Bendis was officially recognized as a state-sanctioned religion in Athens. That is a massive concession. The Athenians were incredibly xenophobic about their gods. They didn't just let foreign cults set up shop in the city center.
It reveals a fascinating socio-political dynamic. Plato's seminal philosophical work, The Republic, literally opens with the narrator, Socrates, walking down to the Athenian port city of Piraeus, specifically to attend the inaugural festival of Bendis.
That is wild.
Right. The fact that the most famous piece of Greek philosophy uses a Thracian religious festival as its setting proves that the Thracian immigrant and mercenary community in Athens was so large and possessed so much economic leverage that the Athenian state had no choice but to officially accommodate their Great Mother.
That is a phenomenal detail. Moving from the Great Mother to the Sky Father, we have to talk about Sabazios.
Sabazios is the Thracian and Phrygian equivalent of a Sky Father god, but he operates very differently than the Greek Zeus.
How so?
Well, Zeus rules from a sterile, distant throne on Mount Olympus. Sabazios is deeply, intimately connected to the wet dirt of the earth. He's the god of vegetation, of agricultural fertility, and crucially, he's the god of beer and ecstatic, wild intoxication.
And he comes with what has to be the strangest artifact in the entire ancient world. I stared at the pictures of this thing in the notes for 20 minutes. It is called the Hand of Sabazios.
Oh, it is a remarkable piece of material theology. The Hand of Sabazios is a type of bronze votive object found scattered across the boundaries of the Roman Empire, wherever Thracian or Phrygian soldiers were stationed.
Okay.
It is a physical bronze cast of a human hand, usually life-sized or slightly smaller. The fingers are permanently locked in a gesture of benediction. The thumb, index, and middle fingers are raised straight up, while the ring and pinky fingers are bent tight against the palm.
But it's not just a hand. The entire surface of the bronze is crawling with this highly specific, bizarre iconography.
The hand is densely packed with symbols. There is almost always a serpent scaling the wrist and slithering over the raised fingers.
Okay, a snake?
Resting precariously on the tip of the thumb is a pine cone. Scattered across the palm and the knuckles, you find frogs, lizards, turtles, a ram's head, and occasionally tucked safely into the hollow of the palm, a tiny mother nursing a child.
It looks like a surrealist sculpture. It looks like Salvador Dali was hired to design a religious artifact. How does an agrarian, mountain-dwelling people end up with an icon that looks like a hallucinatory fever dream?
Because it isn't just an art piece. It is a pocket-sized cathedral.
A pocket-sized cathedral. I love that.
It brings us back to the core problem of the Thracians. They had no books. Because an agrarian Thracian soldier couldn't carry a sacred scroll of theology, the physical arrangement of those bronze symbols was his theology.
Walk us through the translation of that visual text.
Every element represents a cosmic mechanism. The serpent is a chthonic symbol. It lives in the dirt, sheds its skin, and represents the endless cycle of death and rebirth from the underworld.
And it's climbing up.
Right. It is climbing upward toward the heavens. The pine cone resting on the thumb represents the evergreen tree life that miraculously survives the dead of winter, and it is strongly associated with the pineal gland and the ecstatic, mind-altering state induced during Sabazios rituals.
Wow. What about the frogs and turtles?
The frog and the turtle are amphibious creatures. They cross the boundary between water and land, just as the soul crosses the boundary between life and death. The mother and child in the palm represent the ultimate promise of regeneration. The bronze hand is a three-dimensional map of how the universe regenerates itself.
It is breathtaking when you realize you are reading it as a text. And speaking of ecstatic, mind-altering rituals, we have to look at the goddess Kotis, or Kotis.
Kotis govern the absolute extreme edge of Thracian religious practice. She was worshipped through intense, riotous, orgiastic night rites known as the Kotitia.
The Greek sources seem genuinely horrified by her festivals.
The Greeks were highly invested in rigid gender norms and social control, so the Kotitia was their worst nightmare. During her festivals in the deep forests, social order was entirely inverted.
How inverted?
The sources note that men would participate while wearing women's clothing, engaging in gender-bending rituals, frenzied drumming, and unrestrained trance-like dancing designed to shatter the ego and invite the deity into the body.
And despite how wild and chaotic that sounds, this wasn't just a fringe cult for outcasts. The absolute highest levels of power claimed her.
Yes. We discussed King Kotis earlier, the Odrysian ruler, who soldered his name onto the Persian gold.
Right.
He literally took his royal name from this orgiastic goddess. Furthermore, an inscription found on a silver jug in the Rogozan treasure explicitly names King Kotis I as the child of Apollo.
So it's a mix of different energies.
Exactly. It proves that the royal bloodline derived its legitimacy from a potent mixture of high solar order and terrifying ecstatic nocturnal power.
Okay, let's travel far to the north, up toward the Danube River, to the Getae tribe, because their primary god, Zalmoxis, blurs the line between a deity, a prophet, and a philosopher.
Zalmoxis is a fascinating case study in how the Greeks tried and failed to comprehend Thracian philosophy. Herodotus, the famous Greek historian, dedicates a significant passage to Zalmoxis.
But he tries to rationalize him through a Greek lens, right?
Yeah. Herodotus claims that Zalmoxis wasn't a god at all, but rather a human who had been a slave to the famous Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras.
So Herodotus claims this slave learned about math and the soul from a Greek master, bought his freedom, and went back to Thrace to trick the gullible barbarians.
Exactly. Herodotus writes that Zalmoxis built an underground chamber, hid inside it for 3 years so everyone thought he was dead, and then emerged in the 4th year to prove that immortality was real.
That is just ridiculous.
It is a classic example of Greek ethnocentrism. They literally could not stomach the idea that a northern barbarian culture developed a complex theory of the afterlife independently, so they invented a story where a Greek guy taught it to them.
But to the actual Getai people, Zalmoxis was the supreme teacher.
To the Getai, Zalmoxis revealed the ultimate truth. The soul does not perish. He taught that physical death is merely a temporary transition, a shedding of the hardware, before entering a different eternal state of joyous existence.
Wow.
This belief was so deeply ingrained that centuries later, during the Roman era, Zalmoxis was seamlessly syncretized with the Roman god Kronos, or Saturn.
And the notes highlight an incredible academic connection here regarding early Christianity.
It is a phenomenal piece of historical continuity. Scholars analyzing early Christian martyrdom narratives in the Balkan region, specifically the Vitae of St. Dacius, have found deep thematic links.
What kind of links?
Well, the indigenous Thracian belief in Zalmoxis and the joy with which they approached the concept of dying to achieve a better eternal life essentially laid the philosophical and psychological groundwork.
Oh, I see.
When early Christian missionaries arrived centuries later preaching about resurrection and eternal life, the Thracian descendants were already culturally primed to accept and die for that exact theology.
That's the ultimate legacy. And finally, rounding out the pantheon, we have the most ubiquitous figure of all, a god whose face is everywhere but whose actual name we do not even know, the Thracian horseman.
He is the silent guardian of the Thracian landscape. Throughout the Balkans, archaeologists have unearthed over 2,000 individual stone reliefs depicting the exact same composition.
2,000. That implies a level of mass devotion that rivals modern major religions.
It is absolute ubiquity. Every relief shows a rider god mounted on a horse moving toward the right.
Always to the right.
Always. He is often approaching a sacred tree with a snake wrapped around the trunk. Sometimes he is accompanied by a hunting dog, or he is in the act of spearing a wild boar.
But despite carving him 2,000 times, they never wrote down his name.
They didn't. The Greeks, lacking any other context, simply inscribed the word heroes, meaning hero, on the stones.
Just hero.
Yeah. But the sheer volume and the rigorous consistency of the iconography prove that this wasn't just a generic hunting scene. It was a massive shared mythological narrative, a unifying story that resonated across tribal boundaries, uniting the Odrysian plains with the high Bessi mountain peaks.
What does he represent?
He represents the ideal Thracian spirit, mobile, triumphant, and deeply tied to the untamed earth.
So let's step back and look at the enormous canvas we have unrolled today. We started in a massive fractured landscape, tracing how fiercely independent tribes utilized a top-down tributary economy to forge armies capable of bringing the Roman war machine to a halt in the forests.
Right.
We examined their diplomatic genius, taking the high-status gold of the Persian Empire and permanently stamping their own names on it to command authority.
Yep.
We looked at the dizzying mathematics and the metallurgical mastery of their Taurutics, turning silver drinking vessels into celestial calendars.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We descended into the Sveshtari tombs, walking past women made of immortal leaves to find scattered bones and shattered swords, a brutal physical requirement for spiritual liberation.
Yes.
And we navigated the ecstatic, hallucinatory theology of the womb cave, the bronze hand of Sabazios, and the ancient echoes of Orpheus. It is a staggering amount of history.
It truly is.
And the central, abiding irony of this entire deep dive is that despite having no written words of their own, the Thracian voice echoes with deafening volume. It echoes through the architecture of the dirt, and it echoes through 13-pound gold cups.
They force us to listen differently. They prove that civilization does not require an alphabet to achieve immense complexity.
And that leads to a final, really provocative thought I want to leave you with. Think about the massive historical arc of how the Thracians have been perceived. Because the Thracians never codified their own history in a rigid text, they never explicitly defined themselves for the future.
Right.
And because they remained voiceless on parchment, they achieved a very bizarre, completely unique kind of historical immortality. They became a historical mirror.
A void that practically demands to be filled with the observer's own reflection.
Precisely. The ancient Greeks looked north at the Thracian mountains and saw wild, ecstatic mystics and terrifying, uncontrollable nature, because that is exactly what the hyper-rational, heavily constrained Greek city-states both deeply feared and secretly desired. The Roman Empire looked at the Thracians and saw savage, untamable warriors that absolutely needed to be conquered to validate Roman imperial supremacy. Fast forward 2 millennia, and the 20th century Bulgarian communists looked into the exact same dirt, at the exact same artifacts and saw an ancient, utopian, working-class society fighting against wealthy oppressors.
Everyone saw what they wanted to see.
Exactly. By remaining completely silent in the written record, the Thracians forced every single subsequent empire and every single modern political ideology to project their own deepest insecurities, anxieties, and desires onto them. So the ultimate question isn't just who the ancient Thracians actually were.
Right.
The question you have to ask yourself when you look at that blinding, intricately carved gold stag head is, what does our modern obsession with solving their mystery say about us?
It reveals exactly what we are searching for in the dark.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive into the enigmatic, silent, and glittering world of ancient Thrace. Keep an eye out for the hidden histories lurking in plain sight, and we'll see you next time.